The water is everywhere. It moves over fields where grain should be standing over doorways, where smoke should be rising over the flat roofs of towns that only yesterday seemed permanent. In the low light before dawn, a river has forgotten its banks. It spreads like a dark animal across the land, carrying beams, baskets, broken pottery, uprooted reeds, the bodies of goats, the last shape of a house. Somewhere on higher ground, people watch in silence as the world they know becomes a shining plain. The sound is not only the roar of water, it is the sound of memory being made. Long after the mud dries, long after the dead are counted or never found, long after children are born who never saw the flood itself, the story remains. It changes as it passes from mouth to mouth. The water grows higher. The warning becomes stranger. A survivor becomes an ancestor. A boat becomes sacred. A mountain becomes the first dry place in the renewed world. What began as terror becomes explanation. What began as loss becomes origin, and across the planet in places separated by deserts, oceans, mountains, and thousands of years, people keep telling stories in which the world is drowned and begins again. That is the mystery, not because every flood story is the same, and not because they all point neatly to one single event. They do not. The evidence is far more complicated and in many ways far more interesting. Mesopotamian scribes write of a chosen survivor who rides out a divine deluge. South Asian tradition remembers Manu warned by a fish before the waters rise. Greek myth speaks of Deucalion and Pyrrha after an age is washed away. In China, the problem is not simply surviving water, but mastering it, channeling it, turning chaos into order. Across the Americas, among island peoples, river peoples, mountain peoples, and coastal peoples, flood memories appear in forms shaped by local landscapes and local histories. Some are moral stories, some are creation stories, some are ancestral warnings, some seem to carry the smell of real mud. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the question here is not only whether ancient people remembered a flood. The deeper question is why flood became one of the great images of human memory. Why water more than fire, more than wind, more than famine so often appears as the force that ends an age. The answer begins with something simple and dangerous. Civilization grows where water gathers. The first cities do not rise by accident on dry stone far from rivers. They grow in floodplains, deltas, wetlands, estuaries, and coastal margins where soil is rich and movement is easy. Water brings fish reeds, clay trade, irrigation, and harvests. It also brings fever, erosion storms, and sudden death. The same river that feeds a city can erase its lower quarters in a single season. The same sea that carries traders can climb inland under the pressure of storm and tide. The same monsoon that fills reservoirs can turn roads into channels and fields into lakes. Ancient people do not live beside water as a scenic backdrop. They live in negotiation with it. That negotiation is fragile. A river rising gently is blessing. A river rising too far is catastrophe. There is often only a small difference between abundance and ruin. Early farmers understand this with an intimacy modern people can easily miss. A flood is not merely a natural event. It destroys stored food, seed grain, animals, boundary markers, shrines, graves, and the memory of who owned what. It can strip a community of its past and its future at once. When writing exists, the disaster may become a text. When writing does not exist, it becomes a story carried in rhythm, ritual, and warning. What survives in the record suggests that ancient flood traditions are not random inventions floating above reality. Many grow from human life in places where water is both creator and enemy, yet scholars still debate how far memory can travel. Can an oral tradition preserve the echo of a real flood for centuries, for millennia? Sometimes the answer appears to be yes, though not in the clean literal way a modern report records an event. Oral memory compresses time. It turns many disasters into one. It gives the flood a cause, a personality, a moral shape. A storm surge that drowned a coast may become the anger of the sky. A river flood that wiped out settlements may become the end of a corrupt age. A slow rise of the sea over generations may be remembered as a sudden drowning because memory often prefers a single night of terror to a long creeping loss. And then there is the Ice Age shadow behind many of these stories. Around 20,000 years ago, enormous volumes of water were locked in ice. Sea levels were far lower than today. Coastlines stretched outward. Land bridges existed where seas now roll. Then, as the planet warmed, ice melted and oceans rose. This was not one smooth, gentle filling of the world. There were pulses, accelerations, regional disasters, collapsing ice sheets, changing rivers, drowned plains, and coastlines that moved faster than communities could easily follow. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because the most important places for early coastal settlement now lie underwater. Archaeology on drowned landscapes is difficult, expensive, and often impossible. Still, the broad fact is clear: human beings watch the map of the world change. Imagine that for a moment. Not as a chart, not as a geological curve, but as lived experience. A fishing place used by grandparents becomes a reef. A sacred spring turns brackish. A burial ground is eaten by the tide. An island that was once reachable on foot becomes separated by water. A wide plain becomes a bay. These transformations do not need to become one universal flood to matter. They only need to happen often enough in enough places to leave a deep mark on human imagination. Still, the temptation has always been to search for one flood behind all floods. It is an old temptation and a powerful one. A single global catastrophe sounds clean. It promises to gather scattered stories into one dramatic answer. But mainstream geology does not support a recent worldwide flood covering all mountains and destroying all life in the way some later traditions describe. The rocks, ice cores, sediments, fossils, and archaeological timelines do not line up with that claim. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety of flood traditions across the world. But rejecting a single global flood does not mean dismissing the stories. It means listening more carefully, because the real pattern may be richer: not one flood remembered everywhere, but many floods remembered so intensely that human cultures kept returning to the same image. Rivers bursting their banks in Mesopotamia, monsoon-fed waters in South Asia, Yellow River catastrophes in China, Mediterranean tsunamis, drowned coastlines after the Ice Age, island storms, glacial lake outbursts, local disasters, regional disasters, slow disasters, sudden disasters. Each leaves behind survivors. Survivors tell children. Children inherit fear shaped into meaning. Over time, water becomes more than water. It becomes judgment, chaos, cleansing, renewal, the border between a lost world and the world that follows. That is why the Great Flood matters. It is not only an ancient tale about destruction, it is a record of where humans chose to live, what they feared, what they survived, and how they turned catastrophe into memory. The flood is history's mirror, dark and moving. Look into it closely, and the reflection is not one drowned world, but many. The first permanent worlds are built with wet hands. Before walls rise, before temples cast their shadows over packed earth, before kings learn to place their names on clay or stone, there is water moving through the lives of ordinary people. It seeps into fields. It gathers behind simple banks. It fills channels cut by wooden tools and human patience. It leaves behind silt fine enough to hold seed, and it teaches communities the oldest rule of settled life: the land can be persuaded, but never fully controlled. To understand why so many civilizations remember great floods, it is necessary to stand at the beginning of civilization itself, not in palaces, but in mud. The earliest farming communities do not choose river valleys only because they are beautiful or convenient. They choose them because floodplains are among the most generous landscapes on Earth. A river that overflows in the right season renews the soil without anyone needing to understand chemistry. It spreads minerals, organic matter, and moisture across fields that might otherwise harden under the sun. It brings fish into backwaters, birds into marshes, reeds for baskets, and roofing clay for bricks and vessels and roots, along which goods, stories, and strangers can travel. In a world without engines, a river is a road that moves, but every gift carries a hidden edge. The same floodplain that feeds a village also keeps it exposed. Houses made of mud brick can melt under long rain. Granaries can rot. Wells can foul. Animals can drown in their pens. Boundaries disappear when water covers the fields, and when boundaries disappear, arguments follow. A flood may last only days, yet its consequences reach across years. Seed grain lost in one season means hunger in the next. A dead ox means less power to plough. A washed-out canal means work stolen from harvest time. What appears in later myth as the drowning of the whole world often begins in the smaller, sharper truth that for one community the world really did end at the edge of the water. This is one of the quiet reasons flood stories endure. They grow from landscapes where repetition and terror live side by side. A flood is not always an unexpected miracle of destruction. Often it is expected, watched for, measured by experience, welcomed with caution. People learn the color of rising water, the smell of rain upstream, the change in birds, the silence before a storm breaks over distant hills. They know where the river should reach and where it must not. They build their lives around patterns, and then once in a generation or once in several generations the pattern fails. The river rises too early. The rain falls too long. The snowmelt comes with storms. A natural rhythm becomes an assault. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates offers perhaps the most famous example of this bargain. Southern Mesopotamia is flat-low and intensely dependent on water management. The rivers carry life from distant mountains into a hot alluvial plain where irrigation allows fields of barley and date palms to support dense settlements. Yet the rivers can also shift channels, break banks, and flood unpredictably. Unlike the Nile, whose annual rise is comparatively regular, Mesopotamian flooding can be more erratic and destructive. What survives in the record suggests that communities there lived with both engineering confidence and deep anxiety. Canals, levees, and drainage systems are acts of practical intelligence, but they are also admissions of fear. The same pattern appears in different form along the Nile. Egypt depends on inundation so completely that the flood becomes woven into cosmic order. A good flood means fertility, stability, the favor of the gods, and the renewal of life. A flood too low means famine. A flood too high means damage and disease. Even a river famous for regularity can become terrifying when it exceeds memory. The Nile teaches a gentler version of the same lesson. Water creates the world each year, and therefore the world is never entirely secure. Far to the east, the great river systems of China carry another kind of danger. The Yellow River, loaded with fine, loose sediment, can raise its bed above the surrounding plain when silt accumulates between levees. This makes it one of the most dramatic flood threats in human history. When its banks fail, the river can pour across vast areas, change course, and leave devastation over enormous distances. Later Chinese traditions remember ancient struggles not merely to survive floods, but to organize society around controlling them. Scholars still debate how much early flood legend can be tied to specific events, but the connection between water control, political authority, and civilization is unmistakable. In South Asia, monsoon worlds bring yet another rhythm. Rain does not merely fall, it arrives as a season that can define the year. Rivers swell, plains flood, forests drip, and settlements depend on a balance between too little and too much. In the Indus region, urban life grows around river systems whose courses change over time, with floods shifting channels and drying landscapes all playing roles in the long story of settlement and transformation. Here again, water is not a background element. It is a force that determines where people build, what they plant, how they trade, and what they fear losing. Coasts add another layer to the human relationship with water. Estuaries, lagoons, and deltas are rich places crowded with food and movement. They invite settlement because they connect inland and sea. But they also expose people to storm surge erosion, saltwater, intrusion, and sudden changes that arrive from beyond the horizon. Ancient coastal communities may not leave behind monumental ruins as often as inland cities, especially when their sites are drowned or buried beneath later sediment. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is likely that many early communities lived in places now difficult to reach archaeologically. Their losses may survive more clearly in story than in stone. This matters because civilization is often described as humanity's triumph over nature, but early civilization is closer to a negotiation with unstable abundance. People build canals, dikes, terraces, reservoirs, drains, and embankments. They invent calendars to anticipate seasonal change. They develop rituals around rain, river rise, and harvest, because practical control alone is never enough. A canal can be repaired, a levee can be raised, but the storm beyond the mountains, the snow melting too quickly, the sea pushed inland by wind, the river changing course in the night, these remain beyond command. One lesser-known detail is that flood management may have helped create some of the earliest forms of organized authority, but not always in the simple way once imagined. Older theories often claim that large irrigation systems automatically produce centralized states as if canals made kings inevitable. Modern scholarship is more cautious. Communities can manage water locally for long periods without monarchs or empires. Yet large-scale water control does create pressures, coordination, labor measurement, dispute, resolution, storage, repair. Someone must decide when a canal is cleared whose field receives water first, who maintains the bank, and what happens when the structure fails. In this way, water does not simply nourish civilization, it forces society to define power, and when power fails, flood becomes political memory as well as natural memory. A drowned field may be blamed on rain, but a broken levee can be blamed on neglect. A famine after flood can be seen as divine anger, royal weakness, social corruption, or the unravelling of order. This helps explain why later flood stories so often become moral stories. The water is not only high, something in the world has gone wrong. The flood arrives as a sign that the boundary between order and chaos has broken. The earliest cities live close to that boundary. Their people know the confidence of walls and the helplessness of watching water climb them. They know that civilization can look solid in the dry season and fragile in the wet. They know that a town is not only built once, but rebuilt after each disaster, with memory packed into the new foundations. So when ancient cultures speak of a great flood, they are often speaking from the central contradiction of settled life. The places most capable of feeding large populations are also among the places most likely to remind those populations that permanence is an illusion. That contradiction is where the long memory begins. Not in a single drowned world, but in thousands of settlements built beside moving water, each learning that the source of life can become the shape of destruction, and that the mud left behind after catastrophe can hold both the next harvest and the next story. In the oldest cities of southern Mesopotamia, the world is made of clay. Clay forms the walls, the bowls, the bricks beneath the temples, the tablets pressed with signs, the little ceilings that close jars and mark ownership. Clay holds footprints after rain and hardens under the sun. It records what people buy, what they owe, what they worship, and sometimes, with a strange patience, no storyteller could have expected it records what they fear. When the flood enters Mesopotamian memory, it does not arrive first as a polished legend in a book. It rises out of this clay world from rivers that refuse perfect obedience, and from scribes who learn to place catastrophe into words. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is often imagined as a cradle, and the word is useful as long as one remembers that cradles can rock violently. Southern Mesopotamia is astonishingly fertile when water is managed well, but it is not naturally easy. The rivers flow through an open plain with little slope. They carry silt-shift channels and sometimes flood in ways that are difficult to predict. Rainfall in the south is limited, so irrigation becomes essential, yet irrigation also brings its own dangers. Salinization of fields, disputes over channels, dependence on maintenance and vulnerability when systems break. A city here is never simply sitting beside nature. It is constantly negotiating with it, through canals, embankments, labor and ritual. By the 3rd millennium BCE, cities such as Ur, Uruk, Kish, Shurupak, Lagash and others belong to a dense, competitive, deeply interconnected landscape. Their rulers boast their temples, accumulate wealth, their scribes count grain and sheep, and their farmers rely on networks of water control that are both impressive and fragile. The rivers are not just scenery, they are the arteries of the civilization. Boats move goods along them, fields depend on them, cities fear them. And somewhere in this world, perhaps from the memory of a real flood at one city, perhaps from several floods woven together, perhaps from a larger cultural awareness that water can unmake order, the great Mesopotamian flood story begins to take shape. One of the earliest surviving forms appears in Sumerian tradition, in a story where kingship descends from heaven. Cities are founded and then a flood interrupts the sequence of human rule. The flood becomes a dividing line in time. There is before the flood and there is after. That idea alone is powerful. It turns catastrophe into chronology. It says that history itself has a scar. Later king lists preserve this structure in a striking way, naming rulers before the flood, with impossibly long reigns, then allowing kingship to resume afterward. Scholars still debate exactly how to interpret these lists because they mix political memory theology, mythic time, and perhaps faint echoes of early dynastic tradition. But the flood's role is unmistakable. It marks a break so deep that even kingship must begin again. The most famous Mesopotamian flood account survives in the story known through the Epic of Gilgamesh, especially in the version copied by scribes in the 1st millennium BCE, though the tale itself is older. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, seeks the secret of life and death after losing his companion Enkidu. His search leads him to Utnapishtim, a survivor of the Great Flood, a man granted a kind of immortality after escaping the destruction of humanity. Utnapishtim tells how the gods decide to send a flood, how one god secretly warns him, how he builds a great boat, loads it with family craftsmen, animals and precious things, and how the storm overwhelms the land. When the waters finally subside, the boat comes to rest. Birds are released and a sacrifice is offered. The similarities to later flood traditions are obvious, and they have fascinated readers for generations. But the Mesopotamian story is not merely a prototype waiting to be borrowed. It belongs to its own world with its own anxieties. The gods in the story are not all of one mind. Their decision is severe, even excessive. The flood is terrifying, not only because humans suffer, but because the divine order itself seems unstable. Afterward, the gods are disturbed by the scale of destruction. The story carries a kind of ancient unease. If the powers that govern the world can unleash such a disaster, then survival depends not on control, but on fragile favor, secret warning, and luck. There is a lesser-known detail in the older Akkadian Atrahasis epic that makes the flood even more revealing. In that version, the disaster is part of a sequence of attempts to reduce human disturbance. Humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive to the gods. Plague, drought, and famine come before the final flood. The story is mythic, but beneath it lies a recognizable concern of early urban life population, labor, hunger, disease, and the strain of maintaining order in crowded settlements. No single explanation fully accounts for the myth, but it is not difficult to hear in it the pressures of city life in a difficult environment. The flood is cosmic, yet its roots reach into very human problems. The city of Shuruppak often appears in discussions of the Mesopotamian flood, because some traditions identify it as the home of the flood hero. Archaeology has found evidence of significant flooding at Shuruppak and some other sites in southern Mesopotamia around the early 3rd millennium BCE. Thick deposits of water-laid sediment appear in certain excavations suggesting destructive local or regional floods. For a time, discoveries like these encouraged the hope that archaeology had found the flood itself. But the picture is not so simple. Flood layers are not uniform across all sites. They date differently in different places. Some cities show evidence of flooding, others do not. A sediment layer that is dramatic at one settlement may represent a local river event rather than a civilization-wide catastrophe. This is where the mystery becomes more disciplined. The mud beneath the myth matters, but it does not give us permission to flatten all stories into one event. What survives in the ground suggests that floods were real and sometimes severe in early Mesopotamia. What survives in literature suggests that flood became a major image of rupture, judgment, and renewal. The connection between the two is plausible, even likely in a broad sense, but the exact path from disaster to myth remains incomplete. A flood can leave silt in a room. It cannot leave a label explaining how many generations later a priest, singer, or scribe transformed it into the end of the world. Still, the Mesopotamian flood tradition is crucial because it shows how early literate civilization handles catastrophe. It does not merely remember water, it organizes memory around it. The flood becomes part of the architecture of time, separating primeval kings from historical kings, mortal humanity from exceptional survivor, ordinary disaster from divine decision. It becomes portable, copyable, teachable. Scribes practice its lines. Schools preserve its language. Empires inherit it. Later cultures encounter it, reshape it, argue with it, and attach it to their own visions of justice and survival. In Mesopotamia, then, the Great Flood is not an isolated tale floating in imagination. It is a story born in a world where rivers create wealth and threaten ruin, where cities depend on canals that must never be neglected, where mud records both daily accounts and ancient dread. It is the memory of water raised to the scale of cosmos. And once a flood becomes that large in story, it can travel far beyond the banks of the river that first inspired it. Beneath the stories there is mud. It lies in bands, lenses, streaks, and buried surfaces pressed between older floors and newer walls, between one occupation and the next. To an excavator, a flood does not appear as a roaring wall of water. It appears as a silence in the sequence, a layer where ordinary life has been interrupted. The texture changes. The pottery changes position. A floor is sealed. A drain is choked. A room that once held storage jars is filled with clean water-laid silt. The catastrophe has no voice, but it leaves a line. For a long time, these lines seem to promise a direct answer. If nearly all civilizations remember a great flood, perhaps archaeology could simply dig down and find it. In the early decades of Mesopotamian excavation, when teams uncovered thick flood deposits at famous sites, the temptation was immediate and understandable. Here, it seemed, was the ancient deluge made physical. At excavators found a striking layer of clean silt, in places several meters thick, separating occupation levels. At other sites, such as Kish Shurupak and Uruk flood deposits or water damage evidence were also reported. The idea that the Great Flood had been located in the ground captured public imagination, because it joined text tradition and archaeology in one dramatic gesture, but archaeology rarely stays that simple. As more sites were excavated and dating improved, the picture became uneven. Flood layers did not appear everywhere at the same depth. They did not belong to one identical moment. Some were older, some later. Some were thick and dramatic, others modest. Some major settlements showed no comparable deposit at the relevant levels. A flood that devastated one city might leave another untouched. A river could break its bank in one branch of the alluvial plain and not another. In a landscape shaped by shifting channels, levees, marshes, and low gradients, water does not always behave like a single sheet spread evenly across the world. It follows weakness, slope obstruction, and chance. This unevenness matters. It does not make the flood deposits unimportant. It makes them more real. A single worldwide layer would be clean in a way history rarely is. Instead, the ground shows repeated local and regional disasters, precisely the kind of events that would have mattered intensely to the people who lived through them. A city destroyed by flood does not need the entire planet to drown before its survivors speak of the end of the world. Their world is the fields they farm, the temples they serve, the houses they build, the graves they visit, the routes they know. When all of that is underwater, the language of total destruction comes naturally. At the famous flood layer became one of the most discussed examples. The excavator Leonard Woolley believed he'd uncovered evidence of a great flood behind ancient tradition. Later, scholars have been more cautious. The deposit is real, and it indicates a significant flood event, but tying it directly to a specific literary flood story is difficult. It may reflect a major local inundation in the alluvial environment of southern Mesopotamia, not a universal deluge. The evidence remains incomplete, partly because early excavation methods did not always record details with the precision expected today, and partly because floodplains are complex archives. Water can remove as well as deposit. It can mix materials, scour surfaces, and create misleading boundaries. At Shurupak, often linked in tradition with the flood hero flood evidence, has also drawn attention. The site shows traces of a destructive inundation around the early 3rd millennium BCE, and this has encouraged the idea that a real catastrophe there may have contributed to the Mesopotamian flood memory. It is a reasonable possibility, but not a certainty. A story does not preserve an excavation report. It preserves meaning. Even if Shurupak suffered a devastating flood, later traditions may have combined it with other disasters, theological ideas, royal ideology, and older motifs. What survives in myth may be a compressed memory of many waters rather than one. The difficulty deepens when archaeologists move beyond Mesopotamia. Flood deposits are common in river civilizations, but common evidence is not the same as common origin. In the Nile Valley, annual inundation leaves sediments, but those sediments belong to a different rhythm. In the Indus region, river shifts and flood deposits appear at various sites, yet the relationship between flood's urban change and later tradition remains debated. In China, Evidence for major outburst floods has been proposed in connection with early flood legends, but scholars still debate the scale dating and cultural implications. In coastal zones, storms and tsunamis can leave sand sheets inland, but these are often hard to distinguish, date and connect with oral memory. The record is full of clues but few simple signatures. One surprising detail is that some of the most important evidence for ancient flooding may no longer be on land at all. After the last ice age, rising seas covered vast coastal plains where people almost certainly lived, travelled, fished and buried their dead. These drowned landscapes are difficult to study. Sediment waves, modern development and deep water hide or destroy traces. A flood story preserved by descendants may point toward a place now beneath a bay or continental shelf where ordinary excavation cannot easily follow. This means the absence of evidence in some regions is not evidence that no traumatic water event occurred. It may simply mean the archive has sunk, yet caution cuts both ways. Because water disasters are common, it's easy to connect too many things. A flood layer in one place, a myth in another, and a sea level curve across the world can be made to look like pieces of one puzzle, even when they belong to different times and different processes. This is where fringe theories often overreach. They collect flood stories as if similarity alone proves a single ancient catastrophe. They treat myths as literal maps and sediments as confirmation waiting to be claimed. Mainstream archaeology and geology are slower, less dramatic and more demanding. They ask when, where, how deep, how widespread and what cultural connection can actually be demonstrated. That slower approach does not drain the mystery, it sharpens it. The mud beneath the myth shows that ancient people were not inventing the terror of water from nothing. Floods struck real settlements. Some were severe enough to interrupt occupation. Some may have become local turning points. Some were remembered reworked and carried into literature. But archaeology also shows that the world's flood traditions cannot be reduced to one deposit, one river, one storm, or one date. The evidence points instead to a long human intimacy with water disaster. A flood layer is an oddly humble thing. It does not look like the end of the world when placed in a tray or described in a site report. It is silt, sand, clay, perhaps a few broken objects. But inside that layer is a pause in human intention. Someone planned to return to that room. Someone expected the storage jar to remain upright. Someone swept that floor before the water came. Then the river crossed a boundary and the ordinary future was sealed. This is why the mud matters. It keeps the stories from floating completely free of earth while refusing to let them become simple. It tells us that floods were not merely symbols. They were events with weight, depth, smell, and aftermath. But it also reminds us that memory is not sediment. Sediment settles. Memory moves. It is carried by survivors, reshaped by descendants, lifted into ritual, and eventually placed among the oldest explanations for why a world can vanish and another can begin on top of it. Along the Nile, catastrophe wears a different face. It does not always arrive as an enemy from outside the world. It comes as part of the world's own breathing. Each year the river rises, spreads, darkens the fields and retreats. Each year Egypt is remade from water and silt. The flood is so central to life that without it the land itself becomes almost unimaginable. Yet this gentler rhythm hides a sharper truth. A civilization can depend so completely on a flood that too little water is disaster, too much water is disaster, and perfection is never guaranteed. Egypt's relationship with inundation is unlike Mesopotamia's in important ways. The Nile is long coherent and comparatively predictable, fed by seasonal rains far to the south, and carrying fertility into a desert corridor. Ancient Egyptians do not need to fear the river in exactly the same erratic way southern Mesopotamians fear the Tigris and Euphrates. The Nile's annual rise becomes the foundation of agriculture, taxation, calendar, kingship, and cosmic order. It is not merely useful, it is sacred. The black soil left by the flood gives Egypt one of its ancient names, the Black Land set against the red land of desert. Life gathers in that narrow, dark ribbon, while beyond it stretches dryness, glare, and death. But predictability is not the same as safety. A low inundation can mean hunger. A sequence of poor floods can strain storage systems, weaken authority, and leave villages exposed to famine. A very high flood can damage settlements, drown fields at the wrong moment, destroy irrigation work, spread disease, and delay planting. The Nile is benevolent only within limits. Ancient Egyptians understand this deeply. Their civilization celebrates the flood measures, it ritualizes it, and watches it with disciplined attention because the river's generosity must be read like a message whose meaning can change. This is one reason Egypt does not produce a flood tradition exactly like Mesopotamia's world-destroying deluge. For Egypt, the flood is often renewal rather than annihilation. Creation itself is imagined in watery terms, with the first mound rising from primeval waters. The annual inundation echoes that beginning as fields vanish beneath water and then return fertile, as if the first emergence of land is happening again in miniature. Water is not only the force that threatens order, it is also the substance from which order appears. The world begins when land rises out of the flood, yet beneath that elegant cosmic image lies a memory of vulnerability. The primeval waters are not harmless. They represent boundlessness, darkness, and the condition before stable life. Egyptian order depends on keeping chaos at the edge, and the flood is one of the places where that boundary becomes visible. Too little water and the ordered world withers. Too much and the boundary dissolves. The desert may seem like the opposite of flood, but both can erase human intention. One removes water entirely, the other gives it without restraint. A lesser-known detail is the importance of measuring the Nile. Nilometers, structures used to gauge the river's height, were not mere technical instruments. They were tools of administration, taxation, prediction, and anxiety. A good reading could promise abundance. A poor one could warn of hardship. In later periods, the measured height of the flood helped determine tax expectations, because harvest potential depended on inundation. This means the river's rise was translated into numbers, obligations, and political pressure. Water became data long before the modern world imagined itself unique in measuring nature. The Egyptian flood then teaches us something essential about the larger mystery. Not every great flood memory comes from a sudden drowning of the world. Some arise from a recurring event so powerful that it becomes the model for creation, death, and rebirth. The Nile does not need to destroy Egypt in a single legendary catastrophe to shape Egyptian imagination. It only needs to demonstrate year after year that civilization rests on a moving element. There are periods in Egyptian history when climate and river behavior appear to intersect with social stress. The end of the Old Kingdom, for example, has often been discussed in relation to low Nile floods, drought conditions, political fragmentation, and famine imagery. Scholars still debate the exact balance of causes, and no single environmental explanation fully accounts for such a complex historical transformation. States do not collapse simply because water falls short one year. Power administration, regional elite, succession, belief and economy all matter. But the evidence suggests that environmental strain could make existing weaknesses more dangerous. When a society is built along one river, the river's failure is never merely natural. Egyptian texts sometimes describe hunger and disorder in ways that may reflect real anxieties about failed inundation, though interpreting them is difficult. Literary works can exaggerate chaos for moral or political reasons. Later inscriptions can turn hardship into royal propaganda showing a ruler restoring abundance. The evidence remains incomplete, but the recurring image is clear: when the river does not behave, society trembles. Flood is therefore not only a physical phenomenon, it is a measure of whether the world is in balance. The contrast with Mesopotamia is revealing. In Mesopotamian tradition, the Great Flood often appears as interruption punishment, a divine decision that nearly erases humanity. In Egypt, inundation is more often cyclical, creative, and necessary. Yet both traditions grow from the same deeper condition: human life concentrated around water that cannot be fully commanded. One civilization fears the river's violent unpredictability. The other depends on its measured return. Both know that the order is temporary and must be renewed. This may explain why flood imagery across civilizations is so adaptable. In one place it becomes divine wrath, in another cosmic rebirth, in another heroic engineering, in another ancestral migration from drowned land. The physical phenomenon may be similar water crossing boundaries, but the meaning changes with the landscape. A sudden river flood in a flat alluvial city is not remembered like the annual Nile. A tsunami is not remembered like monsoon rain. A slowly advancing sea is not remembered like a levee failure. Yet all can become stories about the fragility of the human world. Egypt's flood memory also reminds us that ancient people do not separate environment and religion as cleanly as modern categories suggest. To say the Nile flood is sacred is not to say Egyptians misunderstand its practical importance. It is to say that practical importance has become vast enough to require sacred language. The river feeds the living, receives the dead in ritual geography marks, time supports kingship, and repeats the pattern of creation. In such a world, hydrology and theology are not enemies. They are two ways of speaking about dependence. So when looking for the Great Flood in Egyptian civilization, one must listen differently. There may be no single ark, no lone survivor on a mountain, no universal drowning remembered in the same form as Mesopotamia. Instead, there is a more subtle and perhaps older rhythm land disappearing under water then returning. Fields erased then reborn. A nation learning that life depends on the annual surrender of solid ground. The flood is not always the end. Sometimes it is the condition for beginning again, and that too belongs to the global pattern. Civilizations remember floods not only because floods kill, but because floods reveal the hidden terms of survival. They show that the ground beneath human order is not fixed. In Egypt, the lesson comes with silt and green shoots, with measured water and patient fields, with a river that is both mercy and warning. The Nile does not need to roar like an apocalypse to teach the ancient world that everything begins in water and everything stable rises from it only for a while. Far from the mud brick cities of Mesopotamia and the measured rise of the Nile, another flood story begins with the small act of attention. A man finds a tiny fish in his hands. The fish asks for protection. It warns that larger creatures will devour it, and the man, instead of ignoring this fragile life, saves it. He places it first in a jar, then in a pond, then in a river, and finally in the sea, because the fish keeps growing beyond each container. Only then does the truth emerge. This is no ordinary fish. It is a divine being, and it has come with a warning: a flood will sweep away the world. This is the South Asian story of Manu, one of the most important flood traditions outside the Near Eastern world. Its details vary across texts and retellings, but the central movement is memorable. Manu protects the fish. The fish saves Manu. A boat is built. The waters rise. The vessel is guided through the flood, sometimes tied to the horn of the great fish, and eventually Manu survives to become an ancestor of humanity, a figure associated with renewal after destruction. The story is not identical to Mesopotamian traditions, though comparisons have often been made. Its own atmosphere is different. The warning begins not with a secret whispered through a wall or a divine quarrel in a crowded heaven, but with care given to a vulnerable creature. That detail matters. It gives the story a moral texture that is not only about obedience or survival, but about recognition. Manu is saved because he responds properly to life in a small form. The world to come depends on a moment that could easily have been missed. Ancient flood stories often turn on warning, but this one turns on attention before warning. The rescuer becomes the rescued. In a landscape where rivers, rains, animals, and humans are bound together, that reversal has deep meaning. South Asia is a world where water arrives in many forms and many moods. The monsoon can transform dust into green abundance and dry riverbeds into rushing channels. Snow and ice in the Himalayas feed immense river systems. Floodplains shift, deltas grow and break coasts. Face storms and seasonal rhythms shape agriculture, travel, disease, and settlement. Water is not only a river in one place. It is sky mountain, plain marsh, sea, and underground flow. To live with it is to live with timing. Rain too late can bring hunger. Rain too heavy can drown fields and villages. A river that nourishes one generation can change course in another. The Manna flood tradition cannot be reduced to one known geological event, and scholars still debate its layers, sources, and development. Some versions appear in early Sanskrit literature and later expand in Puranic traditions. The story changes over time as ancient stories do. It absorbs theology, cosmology, ethics, and ideas about cycles of creation. The evidence remains incomplete, and there is no need to force it into a single historical flood. Yet its setting within South Asian water worlds is not accidental. A society shaped by monsoons and rivers would understand both the promise and terror of water rising beyond human command. The Indus civilization, much older than many surviving textual forms of the Manu story, offers a physical background to this larger world of water and uncertainty. Its cities, including Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and others, emerge in relation to river systems, seasonal water trade routes, and complex environmental adaptation. These urban centres are famous for baked brick architecture, drainage systems, well-standardized weights, and a striking degree of civic planning. They are not cities casually placed upon the land. They are settlements built with careful attention to waterway storage and movement. Yet the rivers around them are not fixed forever. The Indus system floods, channels migrate. Some rivers intensify, others weaken or shift. The Gaga-Hakra region, often discussed in relation to ancient settlement patterns, has drawn long scholarly debate over river courses, monsoon decline, and the changing distribution of communities. The decline of Indus urbanism after around 1900 BCE is not explained by one simple flood or one sudden catastrophe. Current understanding points toward a combination of environmental change, shifting river dynamics, weakening monsoon patterns, changing trade networks, and gradual social transformation. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the civilization story shows again how deeply ancient life is tied to water's reliability. Mohenjo-daro itself shows evidence of repeated rebuilding and flood-related challenges. Built on the Indus floodplain, the city appears to have faced inundation over time, with rebuilding episodes raising structures and streets. Older interpretations sometimes imagined catastrophic floods as a primary cause of the city's end, but scholars are now more cautious. Floods were likely part of the urban experience, perhaps severe at times, but they were one pressure among many. Still, for the inhabitants, repeated flooding would not have felt like an abstract environmental variable. It would have meant mud in streets, damaged walls, contaminated wells, repair labour lost goods, and the constant knowledge that even carefully planned cities remain vulnerable. The Manu story survives from later textual traditions, so it cannot simply be treated as a direct memory of Indus floods. That would go beyond the evidence. But it belongs to a broader cultural region, in which water disaster, river change and renewal after destruction are deeply intelligible themes. What survives in the record suggests not a single continuous memory line that can be confidently traced from one ancient flood deposit to one mythic narrative, but a recurring human problem: how to imagine survival when the waters rise beyond all ordinary boundaries. One surprising feature of the Manu story is that the flood is not only an ending, it is part of a cycle. South Asian cosmology often thinks in vast rhythms of creation, dissolution and renewal. Worlds arise, endure decline, and are dissolved only for creation to begin again. In that setting, a flood is not merely an accident in history. It can become a cosmic reset, a returning of the world to undifferentiated water before order is restored. This gives the story a scale much larger than a riverbank disaster, while still preserving the practical image of a boat, a survivor and guidance through dangerous water. The fish is central to that scale. In later Hindu tradition, the fish is associated with Matsya, an avatar of Vishnu, who preserves life and sacred knowledge through the flood. This is not just a survival tale, but a preservation tale. What must be carried through catastrophe is not only bodies, but order, memory, law, ritual, and the seeds of future life. Flood stories often ask what is worth saving when everything else is lost. In this tradition, survival is not complete unless knowledge survives too. That idea reaches beyond South Asia. In many flood stories, the survivor becomes more than lucky. He or she becomes a bridge between worlds. The survivor remembers the before and inhabits the after. This figure carries continuity across rupture. Manu, like Utnapishtim, like other flood ancestors elsewhere, stands at the narrow crossing where destruction becomes descent. Humanity after the flood is not entirely new, because one memory has passed through the waters, but the South Asian version adds its own quiet lesson. The future begins because someone protects the small, the easily dismiss the life that seems powerless. In a world of overwhelming water, salvation first appears as a fish that can fit in a human palm. That reversal gives the story its enduring force. Civilizations may build cities, canals, walls, drains, and rituals, but survival can still depend on noticing what others overlook. The flood that carries Manu away is mythic, cosmic, and theological. It is not a simple newspaper account of an ancient monsoon, yet it emerges from a world where monsoons can make and break life, where rivers sustain cities and abandon them, where the boundary between blessing and disaster is measured in the timing of the rain. Like the Nile's renewing waters and Mesopotamia's feared inundations, it shows water as the element through which human beings imagine both vulnerability and continuation. And so the pattern widens. The flood is not one story travelling unchanged across the earth. It is a form that different civilizations fill with their own landscapes. In South Asia, it becomes the tale of a saved ancestor, a growing fish, a boat tied to divine guidance, and a world renewed after dissolution. The water rises, but memory rises with it, carrying forward the question that every flood tradition asks in its own way: when the old world disappears, what must survive for a new one to begin? In China, the flood is not remembered only as something to escape. It is remembered as something to govern. The waters do not merely rise, drown, and retreat into mythic distance. They spread across the land as a test of endurance, intelligence, labor, and political order. The hero is not primarily a man who survives in a boat, while the world disappears beneath him. He's a man who studies the movement of water, follows its nature, cuts channels, opens paths, and drains the land until people can live again. In this tradition, the flood does not end when one family reaches safety. It ends when society learns how to make water flow. This is the world of Yu the Great, one of the most important figures in early Chinese flood tradition. Later accounts describe a vast flood during the time of legendary sage rulers, a disaster so severe that waters cover the plains surround mountains and make ordinary agriculture impossible. Before Yu, his father Gun attempts to stop the flood by blocking it, often using embankments or magical expanding earth in later versions. Gun fails. Yu succeeds because he uses a different principle. Instead of merely damming the water, he channels it. He dredges cuts, diverts and guides it toward the sea. He travels constantly, works without rest, and becomes the model of a ruler whose authority is earned through service to the land. The story is deeply political. Yu's flood control is not just engineering. It becomes the foundation of legitimate rule. His success leads to the founding of the Ya dynasty in traditional history, the first dynasty in the classical sequence of Chinese civilization. Scholars still debate the historicity of the Xia, the relationship between legend and archaeology, and how much the Yu story preserves memory of real events. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be too simple to treat the legend as a direct historical report. Yet the association between flood control and state formation is striking. In this tradition, the right to rule begins with the ability to restore order after water has broken the world. China's great river systems make that association understandable. The Yellow River especially is one of the most sediment-heavy major rivers on Earth. It carries fine yellow loess from northern landscapes, and when that sediment settles on the lower plains, it can raise the riverbed. Over time, levered sections may flow above the surrounding land, creating terrifying conditions when banks fail. The river can break through, spread across the plane-shift course, and devastate enormous areas. It has been called both a cradle and a sorrow, and the phrase is not merely poetic. It captures a long historical reality in which fertility and catastrophe come from the same current. Unlike the Nile, whose annual inundation could be treated as a returning order, the Yellow River often appears in history as a force that must be restrained, redirected and repaired. Flood management becomes a recurring duty of governments. Dikes, canals, spillways, labour systems and emergency responses become matters not only of survival, but of legitimacy. A dynasty that cannot manage water risks appearing to have lost the moral order that justifies its rule. Later Chinese political thought would speak of heaven's mandate, but even without reducing history to that idea, floods clearly carried political meaning. When rivers destroy fields and settlements, people do not blame water alone. They ask who failed to prepare, who failed to maintain, who failed to govern. A remarkable modern debate has tried to connect the legend of Yu with a real ancient flood event. Researchers have proposed that around the early 2nd millennium BCE, a massive outburst flood may have occurred on the Upper Yellow River after a landslide dam failed, releasing a great volume of water downstream. Some have suggested that such an event could help explain memories of a great flood around the era, traditionally associated with early dynastic formation. The idea is fascinating, but scholars remain divided over its implications. Even if the flood occurred as proposed, linking it directly to Yu the Xia and the full legendary tradition requires caution. Geological evidence can show water moving through a valley. It cannot by itself prove the later shape of a story. Still, the possibility is important because it shows how myth and earth science can sometimes approach each other without becoming identical. A real flood can be enormous and still not be the whole explanation for a tradition. A legend can preserve the emotional truth of environmental crisis, while rearranging dates, places, heroes and meanings. What survives in the record suggests that early Chinese flood memories may have drawn on more than one source, repeated river disasters, the social need for water control, the moral idea of rulership through labour, and perhaps memories of specific extraordinary events. No single explanation fully accounts for the tradition's endurance. The figure of Yu himself gives the story unusual power. He's not described as resting in comfort while others suffer. Later tradition emphasizes his relentless work, even saying that he passes his own home 3 times without entering, because the flood control labour is too urgent. Whether or not this detail reflects any historical person, it reveals the values attached to the story. The true founder is not the conqueror first, but the organizer of survival. He earns authority by subordinating private life to public necessity. Flood becomes the measure of character. That is a very different kind of flood memory from a story centered on divine punishment or chosen survival. In the Yu tradition, the disaster is not primarily solved by withdrawal from the world. It is solved by engagement with the landscape. Human beings must learn the shape of valleys, the behavior of currents, the direction of drainage, the stubbornness of silt. The flood is a teacher of infrastructure. It demands roads, channels, boundaries, labour crews, and administrative memory. It pushes society toward mapping, measuring, and command. There is a surprising subtlety in the contrast between Gun and Yu. Blocking water fails, guiding water succeeds. This may preserve a practical hydrological insight in mythic form. Water pressed too tightly against barriers can become more dangerous, while giving it channels may reduce destruction. Of course, ancient flood control was never so simple in practice, and embankments remained essential throughout Chinese history. But the symbolic lesson is elegant order does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from understanding the nature of what threatens you. This lesson reaches far beyond China. Many civilizations build their identities around defeating enemies, founding cities, receiving laws, or crossing deserts. Here a foundational act is drainage. The world becomes habitable because water is given a path. That image carries the memory of flood into the structure of society itself. To rule is to keep chaos moving in the right direction. Yet the story also carries uncertainty. Archaeologists continue to investigate early Bronze Age cultures in China, including sites and traditions that may relate to the emergence of complex societies before historically documented dynasties. The line between legend and history is not a wall, but it is not an open road either. Some elements of the Yu story may reflect distant memories of real flood control achievements. Others may be later political theology projected backward. Others may be mythic patterns attached to early rulers to explain why their authority mattered. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible interpretation must hold these possibilities together without forcing them into one answer. What matters for the wider mystery is that China remembers the Great Flood not simply as annihilation, but as the crisis from which ordered civilization emerges. The flood is the adversary that reveals the need for coordination. It turns scattered communities toward collective labor. It turns landscape knowledge into political legitimacy. It turns survival into governance. So the global pattern widens again. In Mesopotamia, flood interrupts history and nearly erases humanity. In Egypt, flood renews the world through sacred rhythm. In South Asia, flood dissolves an age while a saved ancestor carries life and knowledge forward. In China, flood is the chaos that must be channeled before civilization can stand. The same element appears in different moral forms because each landscape asks a different question of its people. Where rivers are unpredictable, the question is how to survive. Where inundation is fertile, how to renew. Where monsoon and cosmic cycles shape imagination, how to preserve life across dissolution. Where silt-heavy rivers threaten vast plains, how to govern water before water governs everything. And beneath all these meanings remains the same physical truth. Human beings build close to water because water gives life. Then again and again, water teaches them that life is conditional. In the Chinese memory of Yu, that lesson becomes a doctrine of civilization. The world after the flood is not merely found. It is made trench by trench, channel by channel, by people who understand that survival depends on learning where the waters want to go. Across the Mediterranean, the flood arrives among mountains, islands, fault lines and broken shores. It does not belong to one river valley alone. It moves through a world where the sea is never far from memory, where earthquakes can lift or sink coasts, where storms can drive waves into harbours, and where ships carry stories as readily as they carry oil, copper, grain and wine. Here the great flood becomes part of a wider imagination of destroyed ages, vanished peoples and fragile human order surrounded by restless water. The Greek story most often remembered is the flood of Deucalion. In its familiar form, the world has become corrupt, violent or impious, and Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a deluge. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned and survives with Pyrrha in a chest or vessel while the waters cover the land. When the flood recedes, they come to rest on a mountain, and humanity is renewed in a strange and symbolic way, often through stones cast behind them that become people. The story has many variations, as Greek myth usually does. It is not a single fixed doctrine, but a flexible tradition shaped by poets, local cults, genealogies, and regional memory. At first glance, Deucalion seems to belong to the same broad family as other survivor stories, warning vessel, flood, mountain, renewal. But the Greek world gives the image its own texture. Greece is a land of steep slopes, narrow plains, sudden torrents, and a deeply indented coastline. Rivers may be short and seasonal, but when rains fall heavily on mountains, water can rush down violently through valleys and settlements. The sea is both road and danger. Earthquakes are frequent in the Aegean region, and earthquakes under or near the sea can produce tsunamis. Ancient communities here live with a different hydrological anxiety from the great alluvial plains of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Water may not always rise slowly across flat fields. It may descend in torrents or arrive from the sea without warning. Mediterranean archaeology and geology show that coastal disasters were real. Tsunami deposits have been studied in various parts of the eastern Mediterranean, though identifying them securely is often difficult. Storm deposits can resemble tsunami deposits. Later disturbance can confuse the record. Dating can be uncertain. Scholars still debate many individual cases, yet the region's tectonic setting leaves no doubt that earthquakes, coastal subsidence, uplift, and sea waves have shaped human experience for thousands of years. A harbour that seems safe can be remade by one violent day. The Bronze Age Aegean offers one of the most dramatic examples of water, earth, and civilization intersecting. The eruption of Thera on the island, now called Santorini, in the 2nd millennium BCE, was one of the major volcanic events of the ancient Mediterranean. It buried settlements in ash, sent shock through the region, and likely generated tsunamis that affected nearby coasts, including parts of Crete. The exact consequences for Minoan civilization remain debated. Older narratives sometimes treated the eruption as a single catastrophic blow that destroyed the Minoans outright. Modern scholarship is more cautious. Minoan society continued after the eruption, though disrupted, and its later decline involved many factors including political, economic, and possibly Mycenaean pressures. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. But for communities close to the event, the combination of ash-darkened skies, shaking ground, and invading sea would have been unforgettable. Such events do not need to become the direct source of Deucalion's flood to matter. The Mediterranean is a story-exchanging machine, Sailors, traders, migrants, and poets move through it constantly. Memories of local inundations, earthquakes, and destroyed coastal towns can attach themselves to older mythic structures. A flood tale heard in one harbour may be reshaped in another. Near Eastern stories may influence Greek traditions through contact trade and translation over long periods. Local Greek flood legends may merge with broader Eastern Mediterranean motifs. The evidence remains incomplete, but cultural exchange around the sea is certain. The Greeks also imagined history as a sequence of ages. Golden, silver, bronze, heroic, iron, the names vary by source, but the idea is clear. Humanity declines, changes, and sometimes must be remade. Flood fits naturally into this worldview. It is not only a disaster, it is a boundary between one human condition and another. In some traditions, the flood of Deucalion ends a violent race and allows a new humanity to arise. Like the Mesopotamian flood, it marks rupture. Like the South Asian flood, it permits renewal. But Greek myth often gives renewal a dry, stony character. After the waters withdraw, people come from stones from the bones of the earth. It is an austere image suited to a rocky land where survival often means coaxing life from difficult ground. There is a lesser-known feature of Greek flood mythology. Deucalion is not the only flood figure. Greek traditions also speak of floods associated with the Gyges and Dardanus, and different regions claim different ancient inundations. This suggests not one uniform Greek memory, but a cluster of flood traditions attached to local landscapes and genealogies. Boeotia Attica, Thessaly, Arcadia, and other regions could preserve their own versions of early disaster. The mythic geography is scattered much like the physical geography. A mountainous peninsula and island world does not produce one flood memory. It produces many. The flood of Agaigs, for example, is associated in later accounts with a very ancient deluge sometimes linked to Attica or Boeotia. The details are shadowy, and ancient chronographers tried to place it into timelines with confidence that modern scholars cannot simply accept. But its existence shows how flood could function as a marker of deep antiquity. To say something happened before or after such a flood was to place it near the edge of memory. Flood becomes a chronological abyss, a way of saying that beyond this point the past is no longer ordinary history. Meanwhile, the story of Dardanus connects flood migration and foundation. In some traditions, flood drives movement leading to the establishment of new peoples or cities. This is another common pattern. Water destroys one place and forces the creation of another. For island and coastal societies, this would have special force. A storm surge, earthquake, or shoreline change can make migration not a heroic choice but a necessity. Later descendants may remember the movement as sacred origin rather than desperate retreat. The Mediterranean also teaches us that flood memory can be linked to collapse without being the whole cause of collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean world experienced widespread disruption. Palace destructions, trade, breakdowns, migrations, warfare, drought stress in some regions, and the end or transformation of several Bronze Age systems. Water disaster was not the single cause of this collapse, but the broader period shows how fragile complex societies can be when multiple pressures converge. A city burned by enemies, a harvest weakened by drought, a harbour damaged by earthquake, a trade route broken by instability, each may become part of a larger memory. That later myth simplifies into the fall of an age. This is important because ancient stories often prefer clean causes. The gods are angry, humanity is corrupt. The flood comes. History by contrast is usually tangled. Disasters overlap. A society rarely collapses from one blow unless it is already vulnerable. The Mediterranean world with its trade networks and ecological variety makes this especially clear. A tsunami may devastate a coast, but recovery depends on politics, food supply, alliances, labour and memory. A flood can be decisive locally while only one thread regionally. Still, for those who live through it, a wall of water does not feel like one thread. It feels absolute. Imagine a coastal settlement in the Aegean after an offshore quake. The ground shakes, animals panic, people run into open spaces. Perhaps the sea withdraws strangely, exposing stones and fish where water should be. Then it returns with force-breaking boats lifting roof beams, dragging storage jars through lanes, filling wells with salt. Survivors climb slopes and look down at a harbour that has become wreckage. Later, when they tell the story, they may not preserve the mechanics of plate tectonics. They preserve the moral shape of terror. The sea crossed its boundary, and the old order failed. In Greek tradition, that failure becomes part of a human drama of guilt, endurance, and renewal. Deucalion and Pyrrha do not simply escape. They stand in an emptied world and face the problem of beginning again. This is one of the deepest reasons flood stories endure. The most frightening part of catastrophe is not always the moment of destruction. It is the morning after, when survival becomes responsibility. What does one do when the familiar world has been washed clean? Whom does one become when the past has no houses left? The Greek answer is stark. The survivors turn to the earth itself. They repopulate the world from stones, as if humanity after disaster must be harder, older, more elemental. It is a mythic image, not a historical report, but it carries emotional truth. After flood, people rebuild from what remains. In rocky lands, what remains is stone. So the Mediterranean adds another layer to the global flood memory. Here, water is tied to sea roads, earthquakes, local deluges, volcanic shock, coastal ruin, migration, and the fall of ages. It is not the steady Nile or the canal world of Mesopotamia, or the monsoon cosmos of South Asia. It is a fractured basin where stories travel and disasters echo from island to island. In that echo, the flood becomes a way of remembering that civilizations do not stand apart from the earth beneath them or the sea around them. They stand inside a moving world, and sometimes the world moves first. Long before written flood stories are pressed into clay or shaped into epic, the sea is already climbing. It does not climb like a wave in a single night across the whole planet. It rises unevenly over generations, with pauses, pulses, local surprises, and long quiet advances that are almost more frightening because they can become normal before they become irreversible. At the end of the last ice age, the world's coastlines are not where they are today. Vast areas now beneath shallow seas are dry land. Plains stretch outward from present shores. River mouths lie far beyond modern beaches. Islands are hills. Channels are valleys. Human beings live, hunt, gather, fish, travel, and bury their dead in landscapes that the ocean will later take. This is one of the deepest backgrounds to the Great Flood mystery. If nearly all civilizations remember overwhelming water, part of the reason may be that humanity's older past is full of drowned places. Around 20,000 years ago, sea level is far lower because enormous volumes of water are locked in ice sheets. As the planet warms, ice melts, and seas rise by more than 100 meters in total. This is not a mythic flood covering mountaintops. It is a real planetary transformation of coastlines repeated in different ways across the world. For communities living near shorelines, it means the map changes within cultural memory. A place where grandparents walked can become tidal flat, then lagoon, then open water. The process is often described in smooth curves, but lived. Reality is never a smooth curve. Sea level rise can accelerate during meltwater pulses. Local land can sink or rise. Storms can breach barriers. Tsunamis can overrun low coasts. River deltas can shift, erode, or drown. Salt water can enter freshwater marshes and wells before the sea visibly claims a settlement. The edge of the world does not simply move, it frays. It turns familiar ground into uncertainty. Consider Doggerland, the now submerged landscape that once connected Britain to continental Europe. It was not a narrow bridge, but a broad region of rivers, marshes, lakes, woodlands, and hunting grounds. Mesolithic people lived and moved through it. Over thousands of years, rising seas reduced it, fragmented it, and finally covered it. A massive submarine landslide off Norway known as the Storegga Slide likely generated tsunamis that struck parts of the North Sea region around 6,200 BCE, when some remnants of Doggerland may still have existed as low-lying land or islands. Scholars still debate exactly how many people lived there at the time, and how decisive the tsunami was in the final drowning of remaining areas. The evidence remains incomplete because the landscape is underwater. But the broad image is extraordinary, a human world now hidden beneath a sea crossed daily by modern ships. Drowned landscapes like Doggerland remind us that archaeology is biased towards survival. Stone monuments impress us because they remain visible. Flooded camps, wooden structures, fish traps, burials, and shore settlements often disappear beneath sediment and water. Some survive in remarkable conditions, but many are lost. This means ancient coastal memory may have been far richer than the material record can show. People who watched shorelines retreat did not need writing to know that their world was being swallowed. They needed only memory-root knowledge and the grief of returning to a place that no longer existed. Similar stories of vanished shores belong to many regions. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf once joined islands and mainland areas into a much larger landmass during lower sea levels. As seas rose, coastlines retreated, and islands took their modern forms. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions in some coastal regions have been argued by researchers to preserve memories of sea level rise and drowned lands, dating back thousands of years, though interpretations require caution. In the Persian Gulf, some scholars have suggested that early Holocene flooding transformed low-lying landscapes that may once have supported human communities. Around the world, continental shelves hold traces of rivers and old land surfaces now offshore. The sea is not empty space. It is often a flooded archive. This matters because a slowly rising sea produces a different kind of flood memory from a sudden river disaster. It may not create one day of terror, at least not always. Instead, it creates a generational sorrow. The old camp is abandoned. The shoreline moves inland. The shellfish beds change. The fresh water becomes brackish. The dead are left behind on land that becomes unreachable. A hill becomes an island, then a reef, then a story about a place under the water. Over time, many slow losses can be remembered as one great drowning because stories condense what life experiences gradually, but suddenness can enter the slow process. A community already living near a rising sea is more vulnerable when storms strike. Barrier islands break. Coastal lagoons open. Tsunamis wash across plains. A marine transgression that takes centuries may be punctuated by nights of disaster. In memory, the distinction between gradual sea level rise and sudden flood can blur. The sea had been coming for generations, but everyone remembers the storm that finally took the village. One lesser-known clue to drowned worlds comes from underwater archaeology and submerged forests. In some places, tree stumps still rooted in ancient soils appear at low tide, or beneath shallow seas remnants of forest drowned by rising water. Fishers have long pulled up bones, tools, and peat from seabeds. These fragments are strangely intimate. They show that the seafloor was once ground underfoot. The modern line between land and sea is not timeless. It is recent geologically speaking, and human beings were present while it moved. The relationship between drowned coastlines and flood myths remains difficult to prove in specific cases. Scholars still debate how long oral traditions can preserve memories of sea level rise and how much later myth reshapes them. It is easy to overclaim. Not every island flood story is a direct memory of the end of the Ice Age. Not every tale of a drowned land records a real mapped coastline. But it is equally careless to assume ancient people forgot everything before writing. Oral cultures can preserve striking environmental information when it's tied to identity, territory, ritual, and survival. The truth likely lies between disbelief and fantasy. Some stories may carry old coastal memories transformed by generations, while others arise from more recent storms, tsunamis, river floods, or symbolic imagination. What sea level rise gives to the flood mystery is scale without requiring a single global deluge. It shows that water really did remake the human world in many places at roughly the broad transition from Ice Age to Holocene. The changes were not uniform and they did not drown all civilizations because most later civilizations arose after much of the rise had already occurred. But they shaped the inherited landscapes of human memory. By the time cities appear beside rivers, humanity already has a much older experience of losing land to water. This may help explain why flood stories so often feel older than history. They speak from the edge of settlement, from coastlines that shift from islands separated from ancestral places below waves. They remember not only towns destroyed, but worlds transformed beyond recognition. A flood story does not need to preserve exact measurements to preserve the emotional fact of disappearance. The water came and the place where people belonged was gone. The sea is especially powerful in memory because it hides its evidence. A burned city leaves ruins. A battlefield may leave bones and weapons. A drought leaves less obvious traces, but the land remains. A drowned coast vanishes from ordinary sight. Its proof is concealed under waves, and so imagination must do part of the work. People stand on a modern shore and tell of land beyond it, land taken by the sea land where ancestors lived. The story becomes a bridge to an invisible geography. In this sense, vanished shores may be among the oldest sources of flood memory. They do not replace Mesopotamian river floods, Nile inundations, Chinese water control legends, or Mediterranean tsunamis. They deepen the background behind all of them. Human beings are a coastal species as much as a riverine one. We follow water for food, travel, fertility, and trade. Again and again the waterline changes the terms of existence. So when ancient and indigenous traditions speak of drowned lands, islands lost, or waters rising over the old world, they may be preserving something more profound than a simple tale of fear. They may be remembering that the earth itself has not always worn the same shape. Civilizations like to imagine their maps are permanent, but the sea knows otherwise. It has crossed plains, divided peoples, swallowed forests, and turned memory into horizon. Long before the first scribe writes of a flood, countless human eyes have watched water claim the distance and have understood that a world can disappear without leaving ruins above the surface. Among all proposed real floods behind ancient memory, few have captured modern imagination like the Black Sea. It lies between southeastern Europe, Anatolia, and the Caucasus, a dark inland sea connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow Bosporus. Its waters hold drowned shorelines, layered sediments, ancient trade routes, and a sense of geographical drama that seems almost designed for mystery. Here in the late 20th century, a striking idea gained attention. Perhaps the Black Sea was once a lower freshwater lake, until rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus and poured in with catastrophic force, drowning a vast landscape and leaving a memory that later echoed in Near Eastern flood traditions. The theory is powerful because it has the shape of a story. A basin lies below the level of the sea. People live around its shores, then a natural barrier fails. Salt water rushes in, the shoreline races inland, villages are lost, survivors flee carrying tales of a great flood. In popular form, the idea has sometimes been presented as a possible source for the biblical flood or older Mesopotamian traditions. It offers a neat bridge between geology and myth, between a dramatic landscape event and some of humanity's most famous stories. But the Black Sea question is not settled, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes it worth examining carefully. The broad geological issue concerns what happened as global sea levels rose after the Ice Age, and how the Black Sea basin reconnected with the Mediterranean. Some researchers have argued for a sudden catastrophic marine inflow through the Bosporus around the mid-Holocene, perhaps around the 6th millennium BCE. Others argue for a more gradual reconnection, different water levels, earlier exchanges, or a less dramatic process. Evidence comes from marine sediments, shells, radiocarbon dates, shoreline features, geophysical surveys and models of water flow, but these lines of evidence have not produced universal agreement. Scholars still debate the timing, speed and human significance of the event. The most dramatic version imagines the Mediterranean standing higher than the Black Sea basin and finally overtopping or cutting through the Bosporus sill. Water would have poured northward with enormous force, converting a lower lake into a larger sea, raising the shoreline and flooding coastal plains. Such an event, if rapid enough, and if people lived in the affected areas, could certainly have become a powerful memory. A shoreline moving visibly within a human lifetime, or even within months, would be devastating. Camps, fields, fishing grounds, paths and graves could vanish. Freshwater ecosystems would change as salt water entered. The edge of the known world would move. Yet the cautious view asks hard questions. How low was the Black Sea before reconnection? How fast did the water rise? Was the inflow catastrophic or more gradual? Were there dense human settlements on the drowned shelves at the relevant time? Can a geological event in the Black Sea be connected convincingly to flood stories written much later in Mesopotamia, whose own river flood traditions have local roots? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the long development of Near Eastern flood mythology. A real Black Sea flooding event may have occurred in some form, but turning it into the master key for all great flood stories overreaches what can be shown. One lesser-known complication is that the Black Sea has a complex water structure. Its deeper waters are largely anoxic, meaning they contain very little oxygen. This can preserve organic materials in unusual ways, and it has made the basin fascinating for archaeology and paleo-environmental study. Shipwrecks can survive in remarkable condition in its depths. Sediments can hold valuable records of changing salinity and environment. But preservation is not the same as simplicity. The very complexity that makes the Black Sea scientifically rich also makes it difficult to interpret. A shell's date, a sediment layer or a drowned shoreline may become part of a debate rather than a final answer. Another complication is cultural geography. The Black Sea region has been a crossroads for millennia, but linking a flood there to Mesopotamian literature requires more than showing that people could have moved or traded. Stories do travel, but they travel through languages, rituals, political worlds, and reinterpretations. A flood memory from the Black Sea, if it existed, might have influenced some traditions, or it might have remained local, or it might have merged with many other water disaster memories. The path from event to epic is never a straight canal. Still, the theory should not be dismissed as fantasy. It is grounded in real questions about post-Ice Age sea level rise basin reconnection and drowned landscapes. It reminds us that regional floods could be enormous without being global. It also demonstrates how difficult it is to move from geology to myth responsibly. The rocks may show a flood, the story may describe a flood, but the space between them is filled with centuries, migrations, languages, and human imagination. The Black Sea also helps reveal why modern audiences are drawn to single-event explanations. They offer narrative satisfaction. One can point to a map, show a breach, imagine the water rushing through, and say there it is. The ancient memory has been found. But history often resists that satisfaction. Mesopotamia already had its own flood-prone rivers. Coastal peoples elsewhere had their own drowned lands. China had its own river catastrophes. South Asia had its own monsoon and river worlds. The Black Sea may be one chapter in the human memory of water, but it cannot easily be the whole book. What survives most clearly from the debate is not certainty, but possibility shaped by caution. It is possible that communities around an older Black Sea shoreline experience dramatic environmental change. It is possible that memories of such changes entered regional storytelling. It is possible that later cultures absorbed distant echoes. But it is also possible that the Black Sea flood theory has been made to carry more mythological weight than the evidence allows. Mainstream scholarship remains divided because the data can support different reconstructions, and because human memory is harder to date than sediment. In the end, the Black Sea question matters because it sits exactly where the flood mystery lives, between earth science and story, between drowned landscapes and inherited meaning. It asks whether a real wall of water might have become a legend. The honest answer is that it might have, but not alone, not simply, and not in a way that closes the case. This sea may have risen there with terrible force. People may have fled from its edge. But even if they did, their memory would have entered a world already full of rivers that flooded coasts that vanished, and civilizations that knew water as both road and ruin. So the Black Sea remains dark, not because nothing is known, but because too many depths overlap. Geological depths, archaeological depths, mythic depths. Beneath its surface may lie traces of old shorelines and human lives, but the greater lesson is broader than one basin. Flood stories endure because water keeps crossing the boundaries people trust, sometimes through a riverbank, sometimes through a storm, sometimes through a strait, sometimes across a coastline that once seemed fixed. And when it happens, survivors do what survivors have always done. They climb, they carry what they can, and later when the water is quiet, they tell the story, as if the world itself had changed shape. Across the Americas, flood stories appear in landscapes so varied that no single image can hold them all. There are glacier-fed rivers and desert washes, tropical lowlands and high Andean valleys, hurricane coasts and volcanic lakes, broad plains where storms gather over grass, and river basins so immense that water becomes a world of its own. If the Old World flood traditions often draw attention because they are written in ancient texts, the Americas remind us that memory does not require tablets, papyrus, or parchment to endure. It can live in ceremony place, names, migration stories, ancestral teaching, and the careful repetition of what must not be forgotten. Flood traditions among indigenous peoples of the Americas are diverse, and they should not be flattened into one simple category. Some describe a world covered by water before land emerges. Some tell of survivors on mountains, rafts, trees, canoes, or floating vessels. Some are connected animals who help restore the world. Some explain the origin of present peoples after an earlier age is destroyed. Others are local memories of rivers, lakes, or coastal waters behaving with terrible force. What survives in the record suggests a wide range of meanings: creation, punishment, cleansing, transformation, migration, and warning. The similarities are real, but so are the differences. This is where caution matters. For a long time, outsiders often treated indigenous flood stories as evidence for whatever theory they already wished to prove, especially the idea of one universal deluge. That approach ignores the integrity of the traditions themselves. A flood story from the Pacific Northwest does not automatically mean the same thing as one from Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Amazon, or the Great Plains. Each belongs to a specific language, landscape, and history. Some have been altered by colonial contact, missionary translation, or later retelling. Some were recorded by outsiders who misunderstood what they heard. Scholars still debate many details, and the evidence remains incomplete. Respecting these stories means allowing them to be local, complex, and alive. In Mesoamerica, flood imagery appears in several traditions connected to cycles of world ages. Among later Nahua traditions, for example, the world is imagined as passing through successive suns or eras, each ending in transformation or destruction. One age may end by flood, with humans changed into fish in some versions. This is not merely a memory of heavy rain. It is part of a cosmology in which creation is unstable, time is cyclical, and the present world is only one fragile arrangement among others. Flood here becomes one mode of cosmic turnover, a way of saying that humanity has existed before, under different conditions, and may not be permanent. In the Maya world, water carries both sacred and dangerous meanings. Caves, cenotes, rain maze, agriculture, and underworld imagery connect water with fertility origin and the passage between realms. The famous Popol Vuh from the Quiche Maya tradition includes destruction of earlier beings, though not in the same simple form as the Near Eastern flood survivor story. Wooden people, flawed and soulless, are destroyed in a catastrophic rain and assault by the things they used and mistreated. The imagery is strange and morally charged. The world turns against beings who fail to live properly within it. No single explanation fully accounts for the scene, but it shows again how water disaster can become a story about failed relationship between humans and the order around them. Farther south, Andean traditions also contain memories of flood and renewal, often tied to mountains' ancestors and the vertical geography of survival. In a land where communities live between high peaks, steep valleys, and powerful rivers, the idea of people surviving on elevated ground has obvious environmental resonance. The Andes are shaped by landslides, glacial lakes, sudden river surges, earthquakes, and intense seasonal variation. A flood in such terrain may not spread like a Mesopotamian plain flood. It may thunder down a valley with debris stones, trees, and mud, transforming a narrow inhabited world in minutes. For those who survive above it, the mountain is not merely scenery, it is refuge. North America offers its own range of water memories. Along the Pacific Northwest, where coastal peoples lived with earthquakes, tsunamis, rivers, and sea travel, some oral traditions have been studied alongside geological evidence for great earthquakes and tsunamis, including events along the Cascadia subduction zone. In some cases, indigenous oral histories appear to preserve memories of coastal subsidence shaking and waves over many generations. Interpretations must be careful, but the convergence between story and geology can be remarkable. It shows that oral tradition can carry environmental knowledge with impressive endurance when the event is tied to place identity and survival. In the interior, floods take different forms. Rivers such as the Mississippi and Missouri can create vast inundations. Glacial meltwater in deep time reshaped parts of the continent, and catastrophic outburst floods such as the Missoula floods at the end of the Ice Age carved dramatic landscapes in the Pacific Northwest long before written history in the region. Connecting these geological events directly to specific traditions is difficult and often speculative, especially given the time depths involved. But the land itself bears witness to water, on a scale that challenges ordinary imagination. Scablands, coulees, boulder fields, and dry channels show that flood can be a landscape maker, not just a human disaster. One surprising lesson from the Americas is that flood stories often place humans in relationship with animals. Birds, fish, muskrats, turtles, coyotes, or other beings may help recover landguide survivors or participate in remaking the world. This differs from traditions where a human patriarch and a divine command dominate the story. It reflects cosmologies in which humans are not the only actors in creation and survival. When water covers the world, restoration may depend on cooperation across species. In some earth diver traditions, an animal dives beneath the water to bring up mud from which land is formed. The flood is not only destruction, it is the watery condition before Earth becomes habitable again. These stories complicate the question of why civilizations remember floods. They suggest that flood memory is not always about civilization, in the narrow sense of cities-states and writing. It can belong to peoples who organize life through kinship, seasonal movement, agriculture, fishing ceremony, and ecological knowledge without monumental urbanism. Flood is a human memory, not only a state memory. It belongs wherever people live with water's abundance and danger. The Americas also expose the danger of assuming similarity means direct connection. Flood stories can arise independently because floods are common and existentially powerful. A river valley society, a coastal fishing community, and a mountain people may all develop stories of overwhelming water without borrowing from one another. At the same time, stories can travel through trade migration, intermarriage, conquest, and religious exchange. The true picture is likely mixed. Some flood traditions are local responses to local hazards. Some are cosmological patterns shared across related cultures. Some may have changed under the influence of Christianity after contact. Each must be approached with historical care. What remains consistent is the emotional grammar of flood. Water crosses a boundary. The familiar world fails. A remnant survives. The land returns or is remade. The survivors inherit responsibility. This grammar is not proof of one global event. It is proof of a recurring human confrontation with environmental power. In the Americas, that confrontation takes forms as varied as the lands themselves: hurricanes on warm seas, tsunamis on cold coasts, swollen rivers in forest basins, lake outbursts below ice, and mountain rain that feeds maize rain that destroys it. By this point in the journey, the original question has changed shape. Nearly all civilizations do not remember a great flood because they all once read the same book or fled the same single wave. They remember floods because water is everywhere in the human story, and because the Americas, like the Old World, are full of places where water has remade the terms of life. The stories differ because the waters differ. Yet the fear beneath them is recognizable. A people looks out over a drowned plain, a broken coast, a valley filled with mud, or a world imagined before land, and understands that survival is never guaranteed. Then they tell the story so the next generation knows where the danger lies, and where, if the waters rise again, memory says there may still be higher ground. A flood does not become a tradition simply because it happens. Many disasters vanish from memory almost as completely as the houses they destroy. A storm tears through a valley, a river takes a village, a coast is abandoned, and within a few generations the names of the dead may be gone. For a flood to survive as story, something more has to occur. The event must be carried. It must be shaped into a form that can cross time. It must become useful, frightening, sacred, beautiful, or necessary enough that people keep repeating it when no living witness remains. This is where the science of remembering disaster begins. Human memory is not a stone tablet inside the mind. It is active, social, and vulnerable. Individuals remember through emotion, place repetition, and meaning. Communities remember through stories, rituals, songs, genealogies, warnings, seasonal practices, and the authority of elders. A disaster that leaves no story may disappear. A disaster tied to law, identity, territory, or sacred order may last for centuries and sometimes far longer than modern assumptions once allowed. Oral tradition is often misunderstood. It is sometimes dismissed as unreliable because it changes or romanticized as perfectly preserving the past without alteration. Both views are too simple. Oral memory can be highly disciplined in some cultures, especially when tied to ceremony, place, and responsibility. It can preserve striking details about landscapes, migrations, eruptions, earthquakes, and floods. But it also transforms events. It compresses time, merges episodes, adds moral causes, changes characters, and reshapes local disaster into cosmic meaning. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases, but the best approach is neither blind acceptance nor automatic disbelief. It is careful listening. Floods are especially likely to be remembered because they attack the foundations of ordinary life. They do not only kill, they rearrange the world. After a flood, the map is different. A river may cut a new channel, a shoreline may retreat, a field may be buried under sand, a sacred place may be unreachable, graves may be exposed or erased. Water can destroy not only objects but orientation. People remember where things used to be because the absence becomes part of identity. Disaster memory often begins with practical warning. Do not build too low. Do not sleep near that channel in the rainy season. Watch the animals when the sea pulls back. Move the herds before the thaw. Store grain higher. Keep a boat. Respect the old watermarks. Such instructions may be told plainly at first. Over time, they may become embedded in myth. A story about ancestors escaping to a hill may preserve the knowledge that the hill is a refuge. A tale of the sea withdrawing before destruction may encode tsunami warning. A myth about a river spirit angered by neglect may preserve the importance of maintaining embankments. The symbolic form does not make the practical content meaningless, yet memory also needs emotion. Floods produce terror that is unusually visual and bodily. People see water rising where it should not be. They hear structures break. They feel current pulling at legs. They smell mud rot and wet ash. They experience darkness, cold, thirst amid undrinkable water hunger after stores are ruined. These sensations make powerful stories because they are easy to imagine even by those who are not there. A child hearing of a flood can picture the world covered. That image travels well. One lesser-known insight from studies of disaster memory is that communities often remember not only the destructive moment, but the failure or success of social response. Who warned whom? Who shared food? Who abandoned the weak? Who repaired the fields? Who lied about danger? Who listened to elders? This is why flood stories so often become moral stories. The water exposes character. In later myth, this may become divine judgment or cosmic justice, but beneath it lies a social truth. Disasters reveal whether a community can hold together. The transformation from event to myth is not a corruption of memory. It is one of memory's methods of survival. A bare statement that water rose in a certain year may be forgotten when the calendar changes. A story in which the first ancestor survives because he listens to a divine warning can be retold for generations. A measured flood height may vanish from record. A sacred mountain where survivors landed can remain a place of identity. Myth preserves by giving memory a structure strong enough to endure. This structure often simplifies. Many floods become one flood. Several generations of shoreline retreat become one night when the sea swallowed the land. Repeated river disasters become the Great Flood before the first kings. A local valley catastrophe becomes the drowning of the world because for the people who survived, the valley was the world that mattered. Modern readers sometimes treat this as exaggeration, but it is also perspective. The word world does not always mean planet. It can mean the inhabited order, the known land, the human horizon. Written traditions add another layer. Once a flood story is written, it can travel differently. It can be copied, edited, canonized, translated, and attached to political or theological systems. Writing preserves, but it also freezes one version while others fade. The Mesopotamian flood story survives partly because scribes copied it. Many other flood memories, perhaps equally important to their communities, left no tablets and are known only through later fragments, or not at all. The global map of flood mythology is therefore shaped by preservation bias. We know best what writing colonial recording archaeology or living tradition has allowed us to know. Memory is also affected by power. Rulers may use flood stories to legitimize authority, as in traditions where the founder controls water or restores order. Priests may use them to explain ritual obligations. Communities may use them to mark difference from neighbors. Colonizers and missionaries may reinterpret them through their own sacred texts. Scholars must therefore ask not only what a flood story says, but when it was recorded by whom, in what language, and under what pressure. No single explanation fully accounts for the survival of any major tradition. Still, certain patterns appear again and again because they answer recurring human needs. Flood stories explain why the world is imperfect, why ancestors matter, why rules exist, why rituals must continue, why certain places are sacred, why people moved, why the sea is feared, why kings must maintain order, why arrogance is dangerous, why survival depends on listening. The flood becomes a vessel for cultural memory because it is large enough to carry many meanings at once. The science of remembering disaster does not remove wonder from these stories. It makes them more human. Behind each mythic flood may stand generations of careful retelling, each adding and preserving, each reshaping terror into instruction. The flood survives because it is never only about water. It is about the fragile bridge between experience and inheritance. Someone saw the water rise, someone survived, someone told a child. The child grew old and told another child, perhaps with a changed name, a sacred animal, a mountain, a god, a warning. And somewhere inside the transformed story, the old fear remains still wet, still moving, still telling the living that the ground beneath them has failed before. When the waters withdraw in flood stories, the world is rarely the same world that went under. The land may look familiar in outline, but its meaning has changed. The survivor steps out onto Mudstone Mountain, or newly exposed earth, and the first task is not only to live, it is to explain why life continues at all. A flood leaves behind more than wreckage. It leaves a question so large that ordinary language struggles to hold it. If everything can be taken away, what makes a world worth rebuilding? This is why floods so often become beginnings. They are endings with a strange fertility inside them. The old order is washed away, but the story does not stop at destruction. It moves toward renewal. A seed saved an animal, released a law, given a sacrifice, made a family, preserved a city, founded a river, channeled a covenant, remembered a mountain, made sacred. The flood is terrible because it erases. It is meaningful because something passes through the erasure. In practical terms, this reflects the reality after disaster. Survivors must re-establish food, shelter, kinship boundaries, and trust. They must decide where to build again and what mistakes to avoid. They must bury or mourn those lost if bodies can be found. They must restore fields, redistribute land, repair irrigation, cleanse wells, replace animals, and rebuild storage. Out of that labor comes a new social order, sometimes more cautious, sometimes more centralized, sometimes more ritualized. A flood can make people ask who has authority, who holds knowledge, and what obligations bind the living together. Myth transforms those questions into origin. Many flood traditions contain the idea that the world before the flood was morally damaged. People had become violent, noisy, impious, careless, greedy, or disordered. The flood then appears as judgment, cleansing, or correction. This does not mean ancient people saw every real flood as deserved punishment in a simple way. The relationship between disaster and morality is more complex. But after catastrophe, communities often search for cause beyond weather. Random suffering is difficult to live with. A moral explanation, even a severe one, gives disaster a shape. It says the flood was not meaningless. It belonged to a larger order, however frightening. This moral pattern appears strongly in Near Eastern and Mediterranean traditions, but is not universal in the same form. In China, as seen through Yu's story, the flood is less about cleansing wicked humanity than about transforming chaos into governable order. In South Asian tradition, flood may belong to cosmic cycles of dissolution and renewal, with preservation depending on divine guidance and moral attentiveness. In indigenous American traditions, flood may be creation, transformation, punishment, migration, or the watery condition from which land emerges. The evidence remains diverse, and no single explanation fully accounts for all flood meanings. Yet a broad tendency remains: flood is rarely just water. It is water made meaningful. One reason the image works so well is that water is both destructive and purifying. Fire destroys and purifies too, but fire consumes what it touches. Flood covers, dissolves, carries away, and leaves sediment behind. It can make the landscape seem washed clean even when the physical aftermath is foul and difficult. It erases tracks, boundaries, and stains. It reduces human structures to fragments. In mythic imagination, this becomes a way to reset time. The world has been returned to an earlier condition, like the primeval waters before creation, and land must emerge again. That return to beginnings is visible in many creation traditions. Before order, there is often water, dark, limitless, undifferentiated. Land rises from it, is spoken into being above it, is pulled from beneath it, or appears as a mound, island, or mountain. Flood reverses creation by sending the ordered world back into water. When the waters recede, creation happens again. This is why flood stories can feel both catastrophic and sacred. They reenact the making of the world in reverse, then forward. There is a lesser-known psychological dimension here. Disasters often divide time into before and after. Survivors speak this way naturally: before the storm, after the river changed, before the sea took the village, after the year of hunger. Flood stories magnify this human habit into cosmic history. Before the flood, people were different. After the flood laws changed, ancestors began, kingship resumed, or the present world took shape. The flood becomes a hinge in time because trauma itself is remembered as a hinge. The survivor figure stands at that hinge. Utnapishtim, Manu Deucalion, Pira Yu, and countless other flood figures are not merely characters. They are instruments of continuity. They carry something across life knowledge, ritual, royal legitimacy, moral law, seeds animals, or memory itself. This is why flood stories often focus so carefully on what enters the boat, reaches the mountain, survives the wave, or remains after the waters pass. The selection matters. A flood asks the most severe question a culture can imagine: if almost everything is lost, what must be saved? Sometimes the answer is biological, humans and animals. Sometimes it is agricultural seeds, crops, the means of future harvest. Sometimes it is ritual sacrifice, prayer, sacred knowledge. Sometimes it is political, the right ruler, the founder, the one who restores order. Sometimes it is ethical humility, obedience, compassion, restraint. The story reveals what a society believes cannot be allowed to drown. Floods also make beginnings because they create empty space. This can be frightening, but in myth, it can become opportunity. After the floodland is available for new distribution, a people can explain why they came to a place, why they own it, why their ancestor was chosen, why their rituals began there. Migration stories often use flood to mark departure from an older homeland. The water closes the past behind the migrants. The new settlement is not merely chosen, it is necessary. There is, however, a dangerous side to flood as renewal. Stories of cleansing can be used to justify destruction, exclusion, or fantasies of pure beginnings. Real disasters do not wash the world clean in a moral sense. They kill unevenly, often harming the vulnerable most. They leave grief, disease, hunger, and injustice. Ancient stories sometimes know this. They are not always as simple as later summaries make them. The gods may regret the flood. Survivors may stand alone in an emptied world. Renewal is not presented as easy. What survives in the record often carries unease alongside hope. That unease is important. If flood stories were only comforting, they would lose their depth. Their power comes from holding two truths together: the world can end and life can continue. Civilizations need both truths. Too much faith in permanence makes people careless. Too much awareness of fragility makes them despair. Flood myth offers a middle path. It remembers destruction while insisting that memory, order, and life can pass through it. This may be why flood stories remain so persistent even in modern cultures with satellites, weather models, geology, and written history. We still understand the emotional structure. A hurricane erases a town. A tsunami crosses an ocean. A river overtops defenses thought secure. A dam fails. A coastline retreats. People return to mud and ask what can be rebuilt. The ancient story has not vanished because the ancient condition has not vanished. We still live beside water, depend on water, and underestimate water. So flood becomes beginning, not because people forget the dead, but because the living must continue. The story honors survival by giving it cosmic weight. It turns rebuilding into creation memory, into lore, and trauma into a warning shaped for the future. When the survivor looks out over the wet earth, the silence is enormous. The old world is gone. But there is mud underfoot, seeds somewhere in the keeping of the living, and the first difficult possibility of a path forward. In that moment, the flood is no longer only the end of history. It is the place where history starts counting again. The idea of one great flood covering the entire planet is powerful, because it feels like an answer large enough for the stories. If Mesopotamia remembers a flood, and Greece remembers a flood, and India, China, the Americas, island cultures, coastal peoples, and mountain peoples all preserve some memory of overwhelming water, then the mind naturally reaches for a single cause, one catastrophe, one ancient drowning, one moment when all later traditions began. It is a beautiful solution in narrative terms. It is also not what the mainstream geological and archaeological evidence shows. A recent worldwide flood high enough to cover all mountains and destroy all land life in the manner imagined by some literal readings of later traditions would leave unmistakable physical evidence. It would appear in ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, ocean deposits, cave formations, fossil distributions, soil profiles, and archaeological sequences. It would disrupt the continuity of human settlement everywhere at the same time. It would produce a global sedimentary signature that could not be easily mistaken for ordinary regional processes. Instead, the record shows a much more complex Earth, local floods, regional floods, tsunamis, glacial outburst, floods, river shifts, sea level rise, droughts, storms, and human societies changing at different times in different places. The evidence remains incomplete in many regions, but it does not support one recent universal deluge. This does not mean flood traditions are false in the crude sense. It means they are not all the same kind of truth. A myth can preserve memory without preserving scale. A story can speak of the whole world when it means the whole known world. A tale can merge several disasters into one. A local flood can become cosmic because the community's entire order has been destroyed. Ancient language is not always using modern geographical categories. When a text says the world was covered, it may be speaking from the horizon of experience, ritual, or theology, not from a satellite map. The false global flood then is false not because ancient people were foolish, but because later readers sometimes ask their stories to answer the wrong kind of question. They treat myth as if it must be either a literal scientific report or a meaningless invention. It is often neither. Flood stories operate in a middle territory where memory, landscape, morality, politics, and cosmology meet. They may begin in real events and grow into sacred history. They may preserve warnings in symbolic form. They may answer why a people lives where it lives, why rulers must maintain order, why humans must behave with humility, or why the present world is not the first. Fringe theories often exploit the emotional force of these stories. They gather similarities from around the world, ignore differences, remove traditions from their local settings, and claim proof of a lost global civilization, a planet-wide cataclysm, or an advanced ancient people destroyed by flood. Some versions are harmless speculation. Others distort archaeology and dismiss the actual achievements of ancient cultures. The problem is not curiosity. Curiosity is necessary. The problem is forcing every clue into a conclusion decided in advance. No single explanation fully accounts for the richness of global flood memory, and the evidence becomes less interesting when it is made to serve a simple myth of modern invention. Mainstream scholarship offers something less dramatic but more durable. It says the world has experienced many floods, some unimaginably large. The Missoula floods in North America released glacial lake waters across the landscape with a force difficult to picture. The Storegga tsunami struck North Atlantic coasts after a submarine landslide. Rivers in China, Mesopotamia, South Asia and elsewhere have repeatedly devastated settled lands. Meltwater pulses after the Ice Age raised seas and drowned coastal plains. Volcanic eruptions and earthquakes have generated waves that remade local worlds. These were not small events to the people or ecosystems caught within them. They were world-ending at human scale. This distinction between planetary scale and human scale is essential. A flood does not need to cover Everest to be remembered as total. It needs to cover the place where people live, the fields they depend on, the graves of their ancestors, the roads to neighboring communities, the shrines where they make offerings, the storage rooms that hold winter food. When that world disappears, the survivor's language becomes absolute, because the experience is absolute. Modern geology can say the event was regional. Human memory can say the world was drowned. Both statements may be true within their own frames. There is a lesser-known irony in the rejection of a single global flood. It actually makes ancient flood traditions more credible, not less. If the only choices are one impossible worldwide deluge or pure fantasy, then the stories seem fragile. But if the real background is many disasters in many watery landscapes, the persistence of flood memory becomes exactly what one would expect. Civilizations rise beside rivers. People crowd coasts. Glacial and post-glacial worlds change dramatically. Monsoons fail or overwhelm. Tsunamis strike without warning. The pattern does not require one miracle. It requires human beings living where water is powerful. The archaeological record supports this plural view. Flood layers appear at some sites but not others. Drowned landscapes exist on continental shelves. Ancient texts preserve different theological meanings. Oral traditions encode local geography. Historical documents record river catastrophes long after mythic traditions form. Geological evidence reveals events too old, too regional or too complex to match any single story neatly. The record is fragmented, but the fragmentation itself is meaningful. It shows a world of repeated vulnerability, not one universal reset. To take flood tradition seriously is therefore to resist both dismissal and overbelief. Dismissal says ancient stories are only primitive explanations. Overbelief says they are literal reports of one hidden global event. A better reading asks what kind of memory each tradition carries. Is it riverine, coastal, cosmic, political, moral, agricultural, migratory, or ritual? Does it reflect a known hazard in the region? Was it recorded before or after contact with other traditions? Does it contain practical environmental knowledge? Does it serve to legitimate authority or explain social order? These questions do not shrink the mystery. They make it more precise. The global flood also fails as a historical explanation because it erases diversity. It turns Manu's fish, Yu's channels, the Nile's renewal, Deucalion stones, Mesopotamian divine unease, indigenous earth diver stories and drowned coastal memories into mere copies of one event. But their differences are the evidence. They show how each culture thinks with its own landscape. A civilization that must measure the Nile imagines flood differently from one that must dredge the Yellow River. A coastal people remembers water differently from a mountain people. A monsoon world gives flood a different rhythm from an earthquake coast. Similarity reveals shared human vulnerability. Difference reveals lived place. Still, one should not go too far in the opposite direction and pretend there are no connections. Stories do travel. Mesopotamian traditions influenced later Near Eastern and Mediterranean texts. Trade migration, conquest, and religious exchange spread motifs. Colonial contact reshaped some recorded indigenous traditions. Human beings borrow powerful images. But borrowing is not the same as universal origin. A flood motif can travel because it already makes sense in places where water is feared. It finds new homes because many homes have known floods. The most honest conclusion is also the most haunting. Nearly all civilizations remember a great flood because floods are among the few disasters capable of becoming both local memory and cosmic metaphor. They destroy boundaries, and so they become stories about the breaking of order itself. They leave mud, and so they become stories about new beginnings. They kill, but they also leave survivors, and survivors tell stories. Across thousands of years, those stories rise, merge, diverge, and settle into the foundations of culture. The false global flood promises one drowned Earth. The real record gives us something stranger, a humanity repeatedly drawn to water for life and repeatedly punished for forgetting its danger. Not one flood, but many. Not one ark, but countless escapes. Not one mountain, but every ridge, roof, tree, hill boat, and memory that kept someone above the rising dark. And perhaps that is why the image feels universal. It does not belong to a single event. It belongs to the condition of being human on a planet where the line between land and water has never been as permanent as civilization wants to believe. After the waters recede, what remains is not only land. What remains is memory. It clings to riverbanks, mountains, coastlines, temple walls, island stories, family lines, and the old warnings spoken in places where water has crossed its boundary before. By the time the Great Flood appears in the traditions of so many peoples, it is no longer one thing. It is river mud in Mesopotamia, sacred inundation in Egypt, a divine fish in South Asia channels, cut through Chinese plains, stones cast on Greek mountains, drowned shores beneath northern seas, ancestral teachings in the Americas, and countless local disasters whose names have vanished while their shape remains. This is the answer that emerges slowly from the evidence. Nearly all civilizations remember a great flood, not because all people witnessed one identical global event, but because water has repeatedly stood at the center of human survival. The places where societies grow are often the same places where floods are most likely to wound them. Rivers feed cities, deltas gather trade, coasts invite movement, monsoons renew fields, lakes and marshes hold food. But these same landscapes are unstable. The line between abundance and destruction is often thin and ancient. People knew it with a closeness modern maps can hide. What survives in the record suggests a world filled with many floods, many memories, and many meanings. Some flood stories may preserve echoes of real disasters. Some may gather several events into one mythic image. Some belong more to cosmology than history. Some explain kingship, morality, migration, creation, or renewal. Scholars still debate individual cases, and the evidence remains incomplete, especially where coastlines are drowned or oral traditions were recorded late. But the larger pattern is clear enough. Flood is one of humanity's oldest languages for saying that order can fail. It is also a language for saying that order can return. That may be the most important reason these stories endure. If flood traditions only described death, they would be unbearable. Instead, they carry survivors. A boat remains, a mountain rises, a fish guides, a channel opens, a bird flies over the waters, a seed is kept dry, a law is remembered, a people begins again. The flood washes away the old world, but the story preserves the bridge into the next one. There is something deeply human in that bridge. Every civilization, however confident, lives with forces beyond its walls. The ancients knew rivers and seas as powers that could not be fully mastered. Modern people know this too, though they often learn it after building too close to coasts, straightening rivers, draining wetlands, and trusting concrete more than memory. The old stories still matter because their warning has not expired. Water still remembers its paths. Storms still find low ground. Seas still rise. A city can still discover that its maps are promises, not guarantees. And so the Great Flood remains one of humanity's most enduring images because it holds both fear and humility. It reminds us that civilizations are not separate from landscape. They are temporary arrangements within it. They stand because rivers behave, rains arrive in seasoned coasts, remain where people expect them, and communities maintain the fragile systems that keep chaos outside the door. When those conditions fail, the old image returns water over thresholds, water over fields, water where memory says land should be. The flood is not a single answer buried somewhere waiting to be found. It is a pattern. It is the memory of living on a changing planet. It is the knowledge that the same water that gives life can take it back. And across the world, from clay tablets to oral tradition, from drowned forests to mountain refugees, human beings have carried that knowledge forward, shaping it into stories large enough to survive the very thing they fear. The water's quiet now. The roar that filled the valleys and plains fades into something softer, a river moving under moonlight, a tide breathing against stones, rain slipping from leaves after the storm has passed. In the long view of time, every flood becomes stillness eventually. Mud settles, reeds return, birds pick their way through shallow pools. People come down from high ground and begin the slow work of naming what is gone. Perhaps that is why these stories linger so deeply. They are not only about catastrophe. They are about the morning after catastrophe, when the world is damaged but not empty, when grief and survival stand in the same wet field. Ancient people understood that memory was a kind of shelter. To remember the flood was to remember where danger came from, where refuge stood what had to be carried, and why arrogance before nature was never wisdom. Civilizations rise with confidence. They measure, build, carve, plant, tax, trade, pray, and record. They turn rivers into canals, shores into harbours, marshes into fields, and seasons into calendars. For a while it can seem as though the world has accepted the shape humans give it. But the flood stories whisper otherwise. They say the land is older than the city, the water is older than the wall, the memory of disaster is older than the king, and still the stories are not hopeless. In nearly every one something survives. Not everything, never everything, but enough. A person, a family, a fragment of knowledge, a handful of seeds, a sacred animal, a mountain path, a warning, a song. The world after the flood is not innocent, it is marked, but it is alive. So the final image is not only of drowning, it is of receding water under a pale sky. A survivor stands where the mud begins to crack in the returning sun. Behind them lies loss too large to measure. Before them lies the difficult silence of beginning again. Somewhere nearby a river continues toward the sea, calm for now, carrying silt memory, and the old promise of both life and danger.